All right, well, welcome everybody to the February 2024 InterReach webinar. We are very happy today to have the focus be on Convergence Postdocs, being the areas or arrows in a large STC, trying to do two things at once. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen briefly. Okay. All right. Everything's a little slow today. All right. Okay. So briefly, I'm taking you back to April 12th, 2022, when we had a webinar where we had just been kicking off the Science and Technology Center, one of the examples Steve just talked about, of these large centers that are intentionally creating the space for convergence and transdisciplinary science. This STC is called STEPS, so Science and Technologies for Phosphorus Sustainability. And the reason that there is an STC about it is because phosphorus is critical to sustaining life on the planet, but the cycle of phosphorus is kind of broken on both ends. You know, it's mined from non-renewable sources, and there's not enough that's taken up as fertilizer. Therefore, it's over applied and a very small percentage enters the human diet. And then the runoff of the excess kind of non-bioavailable or, runoff phosphorus then creates a lot of harmful situations in fresh water. And so it's a wicked problem, and it involves all kinds of different people, exactly the type of thing that a transdisciplinary team is required to solve. So this is just a reminder that what we did was from the very beginning, bake in some science of team science scaffolding and evidence-based practices to the structure within the center. And these are some of the people who are making it all happen. We're in year 3 now. There are 10 core universities spread all over the country. There are, 3 on-site, we call triple bottom line scenario sites, where we can kind of look at real data sets about phosphorus and the flows and the different people that impact those and decisions and practices. So this is, a classic application in what is really a grand experiment of how do we do all these things, and specifically, how do we create that intersection of theory and evidence basis and praxis? So some of the things we talked about when first introducing STEPS as a center is that we were going to, from the beginning, like before we wrote the proposal and hired anybody, we planned on, creating and managing centrally adopted boundary objects. One of those appears here, which is called the P flow diagram. It's grossly oversimplified, but it does its job of kind of being a place we can hang our discussions on and various disciplines can plug into. We have shared folders, some of this stuff is not super complicated. It's just process that enables our teamwork. So shared dictionary, shared reference to libraries. We have applied the comprehensive collaboration planning from Strategies for Team Science Success. Free chapter 45, everyone should get it. Weekly facilitated seminars we have, and then we have structured facilitated facilitated transdisciplinary retreats. And so we've done all these things as planned. We've kind of tried to raise capacity, but something that has come to the forefront and is now kind of my sort of drumbeat that I personally think of is that postdocs are really a critical lifeblood of convergence in a center. So we have 3 postdocs from STEPS here to talk about all of their wisdom that they have kind of gathered and insights for us. It's really exciting because these are people who have a variety of job description writings. Some were very specifically, this job is to do convergence scholarship, to do praxis and scholarship of how do you make convergence real. And some people, as many people in the interreach community can identify with, have kind of backed into it through realizing, okay, this is actually the work that needs to be done, this fusion and synthesis. And so it's really fascinating because these are people who are scholars in their own right. They're established, this Dr. Alison Deviney at NC State, Dr. Kimberly Bourne at App State, although she also is undercover at NC State physically most of the time. And so she's really a true arrow. And then Dr. Ashton Merck also at NC State. And so all of them are going to kind of share their experiences. And I think for this community, it's going to be really fascinating to hear, what is it like? We have all these good intentions. We said, okay, we've got this evidence basis. Let's write it into some roles and really celebrate it and let them focus on this. And of course, we have not gotten it fully right. This is a model that we're going to be developing. And so, as always, really like to invite the shared lived experiences, shared reflections on how can we as community members who might be setting up jobs like this or seeking jobs like this, how can we improve on that? How can we make more space for these folks who have the expertise and maybe a little bit more, I would say, freedom as far as how to dig into the project of weaving things together than some people that might be fragmented in many other directions, as a lot of faculty members might be. So really love the opportunity to focus on the role of the postdoc and these individuals as scholars and their experiences. So with that, I think we'll kind of do a reprise. So now we're at February 13th, 2024, and I'd love to hand it over to our three postdoc guests to be able to share their experiences and lead a discussion. All right, so I will pass it your way, Drs. Deviney, Bourne, and Merck.
All right, you guys are seeing a screen that says Convergence Postdocs. Great. So that is a perfect lead off to our slides. Our slides, work for us. We don't work for the slides. So hopefully this can still allow for an open conversation. So we invite questions, comments in the chat as we're talking. I wanted to keep this estuary slide. This is a metaphor that Christine's used several times. If there is a mixing, there's this mixing zone, we're the ones who live, we're the plants and animals that live in the estuary and are happiest in this sort of brackish water between the open ocean and the safe fresh water. So I think that's an important metaphor to think about in terms of where postdocs fit into convergence research. We are right in the middle of things. So I think we'll go through our backgrounds kind of in keeping with the series that this is part of, where people are really focusing on how their biographies have shaped their experience with this kind of work. And then we're gonna share some shared both challenges as well as benefits of this work. So turn it over to Kim.
Everyone, I'm Kim. So my background is a little bit varied in terms of I am an environmental engineer by training. I got my PhD at Duke with a focus on environmental systems and decisions modeling, a lot of water quality, and policy kind of modeling or modeling to inform policy. So my experience as a doctoral student was fairly interdisciplinary. I was working on a lot of large interdisciplinary teams to think about these kind of large scale water quality problems. And so I got really interested in this kind of idea of how do we combine knowledge across a lot of different fields, especially as it relates to decision making. And so once I finished that degree, I found Christine, we found each other along the way. And so now I'm in this role with STEPS, where my role is much more directly related to convergence. So I'm the person where convergence is directly written into my role. So that's kind of where my place in the center was designed to be. Thank you. Perfect. So this is a few excerpts from my job description, kind of describing what I do. And this is a lot of text, and I'll go through it very briefly. But basically, my role is to kind of do a lot of the background convergence work that is necessary for a large center like this. So things like managing our convergence boundary objects, making sure they're being, or studying how they're being used, and facilitating sessions where we use them to reflect upon our work. And then also doing things like establishing a shared language within our center, figuring out developing methods for how we develop a shared language, and designing facilitated sessions around reflecting upon that language. And it's also part of my role is also to do knowledge mapping. So thinking about like, how do we combine knowledge, or how does knowledge flow throughout the center, and how are we making connections and identifying gaps in maybe like places where we need to be putting more effort, or like where there are places we need to fill gaps in our knowledge. So that's kind of my main role within the center.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn. I'm Alison Deviney. My background's a little different as well. I started out a long time ago on a bachelor's, and after a few false starts in a number of different fields, English, creative writing, some different things, went into construction and grading for about a decade, and then said, well, I probably should go back and finish that degree. So I ended up with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in drawing and painting. And then took another break to do some more construction work and other things. And when we moved to North Carolina back in 2011, I decided, well, I really want to go back to school and do something useful with my life. So ended up studying engineering, and so got my master's and then my PhD in ag engineering here at NC State. So you can see it kind of progressed in an interesting direction. I did a lot of transdisciplinary research through my PhD, even though the science part of it was really focused on nitrogen conservation and recovery and animal waste, and particularly swine waste management, because we have a lot of pigs here in North Carolina. What I really wanted to do was try to understand some of the underlying connections and why the technologies that we'd spent, more than 20 years developing weren't actually getting adopted. So I was looking at stakeholder engagement, trying to map these complex systems and understand some of those relationships. And throughout my graduate work, I also participated in a lot of interdisciplinary and collaborative programs like the NSF's Infuser program, which was designing cohort challenges for graduate students. Although I was not actually a graduate student participant, I was actually a facilitator for that. So I'm not sure how that ended up happening that way, but was also a 2018 FAR Fellow, so the inaugural cohort of the Foundation for Food and Ag Research Fellowship. I got to be part of that, and that funded my PhD. And I was also participating in an Innovations in Collaborative Modeling workshop, which really had a lot of influence in the way I looked at things like stakeholder engagement. So that's just a little bit about how I got where I am now in steps. When I got this postdoc position, it was really kind of unique in that it was sort of designed to fill holes. So there were some recognized gaps in between projects, and they were looking for somebody that could do a little bit of different things. They didn't need a full-time postdoc for any of these particular projects. So one of them was developing and deploying online courses created by STEPS faculty. That's something we call the Convergence Classroom, and I've really kind of assumed a big piece of that now after I've been with STEPS about 1.5 years. I'm also helping to design and implement our research experience, or for undergraduates, our REU program that we do every summer. That's a 10-week program. And the third piece of it was kind of a little bit more vague. So it said creating and applying techniques related to identifying stakeholder groups for various research projects. There was one actually in progress when I joined that Ashton was working on, so I got to help with that. But that piece has allowed me to kind of get my fingers in a lot of different cookie jars and stuff. So I really enjoyed that part of it. But you can see in terms of convergence research, my role is not specifically designed that way, the way Kim's was, but I kind of end up doing it by default anyway. So that's a little about me. And then Ashton.
Yeah, historians are big on, like, if you've got 3 things in a row, you've got a pattern. So I think you'll start to see some patterns when I talk about my background. So I was not hired to work in STEPS. I was hired to work on a different grant funded project, but as is the case with soft money work, if there's work for you to do, people will put you on grants. And so my official department that I'm based in is the Department of Applied Ecology, which is especially funny because I have a PhD in history from Duke. And I focused on business, legal, and policy history. It was related to food and ag, so there is some relationship there. But I think the biggest thing that prepared me for this work is that as a graduate student at Duke, if there was an opportunity to work on an interdisciplinary team, I was doing it. I have actually lost count of the number of interdisciplinary projects I was part of. And you can see here, I worked on such a wide variety of projects that it's a little bit scattered. I've done everything from a early modern digital mapping project with some European historians, a rural electrification project, and I also worked on animal waste management. Strangely, I also have an art degree. I have a bachelor's degree focused on printmaking. And when I was in college, I worked part-time. I didn't think about this until I had to do my biography. I worked part-time in college. A lot of what I ended up doing had to deal with database management and thinking about how to organize information and make sure that everybody who was involved could communicate across this one project. And I didn't really think about how that may have informed my own current obsession with making sure that everybody has the information that they need. I'm also, my background's in history. I'm one of less than 10 people total that have this kind of training in the whole STEP center. So one of the interesting things was, like, as Alison mentioned, I needed to take some leave for work. And so in some ways, Alison was basically stepping in to replace me because there was no one else to do that work. That's how few people there were. Just to go back to talk about the job description a little bit. So you can see I didn't include my original job description. It didn't really matter, but in the first 2 years, I was part of this project. You can see, it says postdoc. It's very focused on the project. The postdoc will work with researchers, will do this research and analyze the data, so on and so forth. I was part of the proposal writing process for this current proposal that I'm funded off of to work on governance. So I've kind of found a way to do what I feel most confident in doing, thinking about the intersections of law, business, and politics. And you can see here, I basically wrote myself into a more convergent role because I think on a spectrum of the 3 of us, I have the least official scope for convergence. So, but if you look at my background, it's sort of like, in some ways, I had to be convergent in order to exist in this space. And it also comes from a background of doing this naturally through other projects. I already had this sort of habit, to use Christine's phrase, the habits of mind. It's hard to break some habits. So I think, oh, yes. I think now we can transition to, we can also talk a little bit more about our biographies, but I think it's more useful to talk about some of these shared challenges as well as benefits. And I think in the interest of ending on a positive note, we'll start with the challenges and then we'll end with the benefits. So maybe to go back to the beginning, and this is just a sort of a list of some of the key things we've noticed, and we'll talk about these in turn. But Kim, maybe if you want to highlight sort of a key challenge that you've experienced in your role, particularly given that convergence is part of your job description.
Totally. Yeah, I think these are kind of the main points of what we identified as the challenges. I think there are a few examples that come to mind. There are tensions with the traditional postdoc model. I think postdocs initially are, meant to hit the ground running, right? We finished our PhD, we've become the experts we promised we would be, and now we are ready to keep on publishing. I think with convergence work, that's a bit more difficult because I was not a trained convergence researcher. I have been inadvertently involved with tangentially convergent work. No one would have used that, verbiage to describe it, but this interdisciplinary work. And so was familiar with it, but not familiar with the literature or the field itself. So I think there was some time in terms of becoming an expert in not just environmental engineering, but also convergence. So publishing is a little bit slower in a role like mine, which is a little bit at tension with the traditional postdoc role, right? Like you're supposed to come in and immediately start publishing papers. So that has been a little bit of a challenge.
Also,
And go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say while you're on this, also, I think one of the challenges with us is like, I think you and I have joked about how you're publishing and you're finding yourself publishing in more social scientific journals, and I'm getting all these publications in engineering journals. And so there's this interesting dimension of, in a traditional postdoc model, you're building out publications, as you mentioned, you're expanding your publication record and you're establishing yourself in a field. And we're experiencing this situation where we may be not building the publication record that could lead to a job in our field, or may not necessarily make us appear competitive for those jobs. I think folks on the call may have thoughts about that, but yeah, in particular for me, it's been really difficult to try to stay connected to my home discipline. And I think you've also talked about this a little bit as well, where you have these environmental engineering publications you'd like to pursue, but you're having to sort of do those as extra on the side. So there is this sort of trade-off of, time, we don't have infinite time to be writing and researching.
Definitely. And that's some of the advice that I've gotten, I think, from folks related to, or from a few folks is, right, like there isn't a convergence department, right? So I have to figure out where I fit, either in my original discipline or, as kind of a home base, and then figure out how to do the convergence work. And so I think being disconnected from my original disciplines kind of, I don't think it makes it impossible, right? Obviously people have done it, but it feels challenging. And so that's kind of one challenge we noted. And the other with power dynamics is a little bit more complicated. From my perspective, and I'll speak just from my perspective, but I'm asking people to do facilitated sessions, surveys, engage with this convergence work. And to a lot of people, I'm some postdoc asking them to do extra things. So that can kind of be difficult to navigate. And I'm lucky to have Christine as my, supporter and always being like, yes, you do have to do these things, which has been very, critical to getting things done. But I think those power dynamics can be difficult, especially when you're asking people to do extra work. So from my perspective, that's been kind of the challenge with power dynamics.
Maybe Allison, I feel like Kim and I have been talking a lot back and forth. Maybe if you want to go back to some of the tensions, I think you had this great point in our pre-call discussions about how it feels like you're doing your dissertation over again. And kind of that connection between our own sense of epistemic humility and also trying to establish ourselves as people deserving of authority.
Right, as credible researchers, even though
Yeah.
we're not researching in our specific disciplines. I think one of the things that I've really come to appreciate, and this is why I made that comment about doing my dissertation over again, is because, even then, I mean, even though my PhD is in agricultural engineering and I went through all the coursework, I've done all of the things that are engineering related. I've also done, on top of that, a lot of things that are social science related. So I do think of myself as an engineer, but I also think of myself in some ways as a social scientist also. So I don't think we're defined necessarily by our degrees, but more by our interests and how we pursue them. So, I mean, I've had the good fortune to be either a co-author or lead author on now 4 going on 5 publications, one, 6th one still under review and another one in still the planning stages with steps. And that's in 18 months. So I feel like that's a pretty good record for publications, but none of them are on agricultural engineering. So, yeah, I mean, it's just been an interesting process. In terms of the power dynamics, a lot of it is things, being asked to do things or things coming to you as opposed to being the originator of the ideas. So that to me is one of the biggest challenges because we really don't have the authority to create the proposals or be the lead PIs on things at this point. So I feel like that's one experience that maybe is still lacking at this point, but and then we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and that's why I put down, I think it's really a question of like, we have pretty limited agency in this scenario. And I think that's, partially baked into the role of the postdoc. Postdocs are really uncommon in history. And when you are a postdoc, it's usually sort of a fake role that has been invented so that you can work on your book in the proximity of other people. And so when I tell people I have a postdoc, they're like, oh, you have so much time to work on your book. And I'm like, no, I have no time. It's really hard to explain to folks in my field that I have this full-time research gig in which I don't always get to control the research direction. This is like unheard of for them. But I also want, while we're here and while we're on this page, I don't want to dwell on challenges too long. I think one thing that we've all experienced in various ways is like, it's worth noting, we're all white women. We're all relatively recent PhDs. I think also one last thing, and then we'll move on to some benefits, because that is also really important. I think one thing we're just all dealing with is this sense that postdocs are designed to be temporary, but the sorts of roles we're playing, I think we're seeing how they should be ongoing in a center like this. And trying to figure out, not only for us, we're investing in this institution while we're in this temporary role, but what's going to be lost when we leave, and how can we sort of mitigate that? You don't know. Do you guys feel the same way about that?
Yeah, I feel like it's taken so long to come up to speed. I can't imagine. I mean, whoever comes in after us is going to have to start all over again, it feels like.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's hard because there are all these projects I'm now so invested in completing, and it feels like all of it, at this point is just in my head and hasn't been quite put to paper that I have to stay until they're completed. But I think that's a pretty common postdoc experience. I don't think that's unique to Convergence work.
That's probably true. Although I think that's the difference, right? Is there's this expectation baked into the postdoc experience that you, of course, will move on to a tenure track job, and that's increasingly not the case. And so I think all of us are wrestling with, okay, what if the next thing is not this? Then like, what was the point? I don't know. I'm dealing with that. Like, what was the point of doing all this too? And so I think maybe some encouragement that the Convergence work will be relevant beyond this role might be useful. Okay. Let's go to benefits. Oh, real quick, let's answer this question in the chat from Jeremy. Christine is probably the right person to answer this question. Yeah, I will say from my experience that the way that these NSF funding works, I've asked if I can transition out of a postdoc role into a more like staff role, and there's sort of arguments for that there's money set aside for postdocs, and there would be less money available if I moved out of that role. And so that's an interesting barrier to think about in terms of people's mobility between roles. Okay, benefits. Who wants to take this? Kimber, Alison.
I can start.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I think one of the, being someone coming from an engineering background, all of a sudden being, thrust into linguistics, social science, psychology, all the different fields, that kind of form a lot of the basis of what we talk about in science and team sciences, like, for me has been really interesting in terms of like opening up a whole new area of work, but also, having it be a new field where there's lots to continue to explore has been really beneficial as a postdoc, because it feels like the possibilities are endless in terms of what I can explore within this field, and the directions I can take it. So in a lot of ways, the ambiguity of like, where do we go next? What do we do next is also liberating, and exciting.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And add that one of the benefits that I really feel like I'm getting out of this is improving certain professional skills that I would not have done in a very discipline specific way if I'd been working, for example, in a lab. The ability to network, the ability to facilitate, the ability to talk with people, which as a introvert is not a comfortable place for me to be, but I've learned how to do this a little bit more effectively. Communicate. It all ties into some of the challenges that I was recognizing in my dissertation, and then being able to continue that work and being able to explore those pieces further. I really feel like it's been a huge benefit. I can't think of anywhere else I could have been able to do these things.
Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. I wholeheartedly agree with both of these points. I will just flag, I do think it's really delightful to be all presenting together, because the cohort effect of this has been, it's like, I don't know, I wish I had a better way to like quantify the experience of like having like-minded people in a similar role. It would be 10,000 times harder to do some of the work that I did if I had not had you guys kind of being supportive of this work. I'll also flag, at least for me, historians are really bad at articulating our methods. That's just not, we do archival research. That's what we do. And so being in this space, people are like, what is archival research? What is it that you do? Having to basically explain my entire approach every day on an ongoing basis has been actually incredibly intellectually beneficial for me. Deeply annoying at times, but very, very beneficial, I think, for any future work. And one thing I keep being struck by is being in a space where I'm exposed to entirely new questions and new areas of research means that I'm constantly, going on Web of Science or whatever. And I'm like, surely there's, I'm not going Web of Science for this. I'm going to whatever JSTOR. And I'm like, surely there's some historical research on this topic, and there's like nothing. And it's not even like, oh, somebody wrote about this 10 years ago. It's like, oh, no one has ever written on this topic. And so these like enormous, like gaping research gaps back in my home fields, it's very exciting to be doing this work and know that, if I ever did want to go take that back to my home field, like I could, and it would be this notable contribution. So that's something I'm looking forward to potentially doing in the future. And that's sort of where I see this work going for me, is like, if I'm able to kind of continue staying engaged with my own field, sort of letting this work inform that, but it's not happening now for various reasons. And I think there's anything else
I do want to touch on one more thing that I think has been a big benefit of being part of STEPS as a Convergence Research Center. So I know you mentioned earlier that the center supports a lot of the things that we're doing as Convergence postdocs. And to me, that's really a critical piece of it. If I didn't have that support, if I didn't have the mentors that I did, like Christine, like John Klassen, like Jacob Jones and Mon Cucciara, all the people that I work with have just been absolutely fantastic. And without that support, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing what I'm doing and taking the risks that I'm taking or stepping out of my comfort zone. So I think that's just something important to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. All right, do we want to move on to maybe building on that point? So if you are a mentor, PI, faculty, or administrator, and you would like to support postdocs like us, we have some thoughts for you. First is, I do think it really helps if you can point to your job description and say, no, this is part of my job. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Even if it's in a vague way, kind of the way Alison's is written, leaving scope for convergence. I'm just going to name these and we can talk about them in a moment. And then recognizing that this can take longer. And also being able, and then by extension, being able and willing to defend our work when it comes time for, say, NSF site visits. And I think one way we can do that is encouraging people like us to keep track of kind of these difficult to quantify or just a broader range of outputs and outcomes, recognizing that it may not look like the traditional, we published a peer-reviewed publication in environmental science and technology. It might look different. And recognizing, maybe it's, I collaborated with, 15 people from 15 disciplines, right? And then this last one is, I think, well, Alison, did we talk about this on this call or before, where you're being written into a proposal, but you're being written into it as education and outreach? Can you talk a little bit about that, about kind of how both the center's perception of what our career paths are and our own career paths is sort of this ever evolving thing?
Right. This is to my point about we're not defined by our disciplines. So as part of a new proposal that's in process, so I won't go into any detail about it, but it's interesting that as an ag engineer, my role was actually defined as education and outreach. So clearly in that particular piece, this is what I do. It doesn't mean that I don't know these other things, but if I didn't know these other things, it would be much, much harder to do that education outreach because I wouldn't understand a lot of the science that's behind some of the things that we're talking about. So I feel like it all ties together. Yeah.
I don't know, Kim, do you want to comment on any of these points?
I think you pretty much covered it. Yeah, I think I don't have anything.
I'll just point out that I think we've all experienced the second point personally, where there's been conversations about the need for, like, this is taking too long. This is, we need to find something that's, publishable. And so I think in terms of what would be useful from the insights community is like, where can we publish this stuff? Because we've definitely run into this as a challenge. And I think it's worth overcoming. Like, I'm not complaining about it. I think it's just more like seems to be an ongoing challenge of identifying the right venues that are sympathetic to this work that spans boundaries. And maybe that's just like, it's a feature, not a bug, right? That if you're doing important boundary spanning work, it's going to be difficult to get it published in journals that are necessarily defined by disciplines. And maybe that's just the challenge of convergence work. And the last one I will just point out, I think one thing that's been interesting is sort of like, as I've gone through this postdoc, on the one, at one point I was interested in trying to figure out how to write a grant proposal so I could move into a PI role. I've also tried facilitation. And so I think like recognizing that people who are going to go into these roles, who find this convergence work appealing, may also sort of need to do a little bit of exploration of different types of experiences, and sort of just recognizing that and understanding that part of being a Convergence postdoc means that you are open to a variety of experiences, and not assuming that we just want to have one outcome or open to one outcome. Yes. Okay, sorry, I was reading the chat.
Steve, do you want to go ahead?
Yep. So we'll end with this set of questions for you all, which is, kind of a more practical, like, what should we do now? But also, we have two questions, and I think I'll just read them really quickly and then we can talk about them a bit. And they're two different versions of the same question, really, which is like, whose job should Convergence be? Should we be focusing on broadening the scope of people who can do this? So instead of having it be 3 of us, what if there were 10 of us, right? But we all had little pieces of Convergence work, and we all had more of us had opportunities to do Convergence. And then the second question, should this be assigned to postdocs at all? Is there something important about Convergence work that needs to be in this ongoing, more long-term role? So those are our questions to you all, which is, this has been our experience as Convergence postdocs. There's been challenges, there's been benefits. We see opportunities for more people with these roles, but we also see potential for these roles to be imagined differently depending on your institutional needs and what opportunities you're able to offer people. I don't know, do you guys have any closing thoughts?
No, I'm just reading this post here by
Oh, Stephen.
in the chat. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, well, I just saw Steve Fiore, and then we'll get to Ed's question after.
Yeah, I was going to comment about the journals. I definitely take a look at the compilation that the ITD Alliance has put together, but I'd just be cautious about trying to start your own journal. The journals, the publication space is in quite a state of flux now. There's just a lot going on, and it's a lot of work to start a journal, but more importantly, you have to think about who are you trying to influence? Who is the audience, and what's the message you're trying to get across? So I think that the list that the ITD provides is probably most appropriate, because the nature of the convergent science should really be addressing a particular field. With that said, though, if you want to publish articles that are talking about what integration experts kind of do, then there is a possibility that you may want to go towards a more group or teams kind of journal. If it is about convergent science, though, in addition to the interdisciplinary ones that are on that list, there's a new one that's out by Cell Press, relatively new. It's called iScience, where the I stands for interdisciplinary. And they specifically were created to publish what we would consider convergence kinds of research. So it's an interesting kind of journal. I've been in conversations with the editors of that lately, trying to talk to them about how to broaden the reach and to encourage their promotion to this kind of community. So I'll put the link to that journal on the website, and I think people should take a look at that, because I think it's a nice outlet.
Thank you. I do think that's a really great point about just like the journal landscape is very much in flux for many reasons. Okay, I'm now reading Ed's 4-part question. I'm gonna let the audience, I'm gonna ask the audience for their thoughts on Ed's question. And then we can jump in if we need to.
I have thoughts on, and I'm sure Steve may too, and Chris Lund and others that I see. The science of team science is one of those things like global warming that got named, but like not quite nailed down for what it means now and what the really what the leading idea is. So science is in it twice, but it's not intended to exclude fields that don't think of themselves as science, just rigor, right? So it's really, I think the frame of science of team science doesn't necessarily linguistically lend itself to what is really felt as the need. And I do think that that forefronting of like this intersection of values and decision criteria that are not based on natural sciences and engineering outputs, but actually sort of a blending of this kind of value-based and decision structure and other fruitful knowledge generation. I think you're right. We need to think about how do you intentionally invite and maybe equally invite these different epistemologies. But Ed, please.
Yeah, I'll just note that there's a particular approach to rigor can become rigor mortis. So one of the things that happens with a science approach is that you want to identify a single variable, and you want to develop some type of hypothesis that you can then test, and you want to do that in a rigorous way. But the context of convergence, I'm sorry, is just not amenable to that. Not if you're talking about the implications of a set of very complicated interactions in a world that involves people, and where people are in fact the biggest issue in not just understanding what's going on, but actually thinking about any kind of response to address. I'm not going to say solve, because we're way too focused on solving problems that are not fully solvable, but to address the reason it's a wicked problem is because it's not easy to approach. And I think there's an arrogance that comes with the notion of science. That's also part of the problem.
Yeah, my joking version of what it is that I do in STEPS is that I just yell at scientists for assuming that science and technology will solve problems. Makes me really popular. I also think too, there's something interesting about like convergence as such, like what Christine has described as studying ourselves, studying the processes and practices of convergence, which I think is of more interest to this community. But then I think also we're starting to see those projects that would not be possible without these convergence practices that are in place, and that they're still of disciplinary relevance. And those are two different kinds of projects. And they also call for two different kinds of audiences as well. So, but yeah, that's something people seem to forget, is that the definition of wicked problems is that they are maybe fundamentally unsolvable. Like that's in the original article. Defining.
But definitely addressable.
Sure. Addressable. We need a different word for that.
Well, and I think that's one of the things like I'm most interested in coming from an engineering background is, most of our work is done a little bit in a vacuum, in this kind of research vacuum. And so for me, convergence is not just about studying ourselves and how we're working, but how we're integrating information from all these different sources, including stakeholders and people and other researchers, right? So we're not kind of getting the solutions tunnel vision almost of, I've thought of this solution, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to keep going at it, and instead welcoming alternative thoughts and input.
Well, and that's like, I'll just really quick. Kim and I talked about how this creeps into the writing as well. The way that engineers write introductions versus the way historians write introductions versus the way political scientists write introductions of papers. engineers are like, here's a giant problem. This is how I'm going to solve it. Historians are like, well, let me tell you about 1742, blah, blah, blah. And then the political scientists are like, there's this theory, and I'm going to describe to you this theory, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. And and this is all the things that I think are so interesting, and they're so hard to capture and quantify because you have no real way to show what would have happened if that convergence experience wasn't there. You have no way to say, like, Kim would have written that introduction differently. She would have framed that paper completely differently if she was not working in this space. So sorry, Steve.
Yeah, I just to echo the point that Christine made, that the science of team science as a label is really about trying to understand collaboration. In science teams, or those teams can consist of a number of different stakeholders. So what are the kinds of collaboration processes, the group dynamics that alter the interactions, that alter the way knowledge is produced to address a particular problem? So that's the first point. The second point is I think you're assuming that everybody has adopted, you're presupposing this definition of science you provided as something that is monolithic, that everyone who does this kind of work adopts that, and I don't think that's the case at all. Second, NSF has created the concept of convergence science to particularly try to get people to address these more complex challenges, and honestly, that's a bit of branding. Because convergence science is really just a relabeling of what the Europeans have called transdisciplinary science. And if you read the literature on interdisciplinarity, going back into the early 20th century, people were talking about what we now call wicked problems. So I don't think it's a matter of misalignment. I think it's a matter of deciding how you want to label something. And I don't think that should really limit people trying to understand these phenomena. And I don't know that we want to start creating a specific area or a specific label or a specific organization to address these kinds of collaborations that deal with what you would refer to as wicked problems.
Yeah, that reminds me of something interesting. When I first started learning about convergence, I didn't know anything about it when I started this postdoc position. And so I looked up the NSF definition, and I feel like what we do in STEPS has really evolved from that original definition, which to me seemed like it was much narrower in scope. So they're looking at the convergence between very specific, very in-depth perspectives of science, maybe something from medicine versus something from engineering versus something from biology. Whereas we look at it at a much broader scope. We're integrating every possible discipline that is interested in working with us. And I feel like that's really changed our perspective and how we look at the questions that we're trying to address and then how we're actually answering those. So I don't know if anyone else has a similar thought, but it's just my take on it.
Maybe since we're at time, I'll just end by noting that convergence is hard, but in our experience, it's been worth it. And so that's what I think we should all maybe take away from this, and we were happy to stay on for folks who want to continue chatting. But I know people need to run to their next meeting. So just want to thank everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, you guys. And there's also an opportunity to have a reading and discussion club conversation to continue this conversation. So if anyone is interested in that, Christine put a link to it in the chat, but we're post this recording from today's session on our website in probably about a week. So thank you all so much for sharing your experiences, and thanks to the participants that are left and those that were with us earlier. And we'll see you guys again next month.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity
Thank
to
you.
present.
Yeah.